Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming to today's event. So we're going to have a talk today about plagiarism, integrity, academic integrity, plagiarism, and citations. And I'd like to introduce our speakers today. We have Erin Patterson, who's one of our librarians at Vaughan Memorial Library. She'll be starting off and talking to you today and giving you a bit of a presentation. And we also have one of our professors, Dr. Paul Abela from the Department of Philosophy, will also be joining in and discussing things with us today. So I'm going to go ahead and let Erin start off, and then if you have any questions, you can type them in, and we won't publish them live until after everybody's finished speaking, our speakers, but go ahead and send the questions on if you have a question that you think of at the time, and we'll have it and save it and send it later. Go ahead, Erin.
Okay, thanks. I hope I'm sharing my screen properly and that everybody can see this definition of plagiarism, which is a serious academic offense, and it is the act of presenting the ideas or words of another as one's own. And this is a perfect example of plagiarism because I actually plagiarized in this very slide. I lifted that definition of plagiarism word for word from somewhere else, but I haven't in any way indicated on this slide that I did that those aren't my own words. So now I haven't plagiarized. The only change I made was to put quotation marks around the words that weren't my own and to add some citation information. So I got this out of Acadia University's academic calendar. So there, that's plagiarism. We're done. Any questions? Just kidding. We have a little more to talk about. So I think I can stop sharing my screen for a bit. If I can figure out how to do that. There we go. So plagiarism includes things like I just showed you. It also includes deliberate acts that I think most of you would know are dishonest. So things like downloading a paper from the web or buying a paper from someone else or getting someone else to write your paper for you and passing it off as your own. That's pretty obvious that that's a violation of academic integrity. But it also includes a lot of things that are accidental, really unintentional acts that can be byproducts of the research process. So for instance, your professors are going to tell you, I can guarantee this 100%, your profs are going to tell you to do research. And that does not mean just Googling stuff. That's a topic for another day. But they're going to ask you to do research. And when you research a topic, you're finding out what other people have already written and said about that topic. And then you build on what you find out in your research. You build on that with your own ideas, your own responses, your own criticisms, whatever. So it's a little bit like a conversation across the years. So scholar X writes something in 2004, whenever, and you find it in your research and you read it and you refer to it in your assignment, you engage with it somehow. You might say, Scholar X says blah, 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 but I disagree for these reasons. So it's a crucial part of the research process to give credit to refer to cite Scholar X, whoever your sources are. And forgetting or failing to properly do that, to cite those sources, even if it's an honest mistake, technically still constitutes plagiarism and is possibly subject to the same penalties as other more intentional forms of plagiarism. So using another scholar's ideas or words is a normal and expected part of academic work, but you must clearly indicate when you are doing this. Acadia's calendar also goes on to say that self-plagiarism is also a form of plagiarism. And that's when you submit the same paper to 2 different courses, for instance. If there were a situation where you could do that, if you did it without the permission of both instructors, that would also constitute plagiarism. And finally, Acadia's calendar also notes that a student who knowingly helps another student commit an act of academic dishonesty is equally guilty. So to recap, what plagiarism is, it includes those obvious bad things like buying a paper or getting a buddy to write it for you, or just copying wholesale from wherever. Less obvious things like simply failing to cite a source, or self-plagiarism, submitting the same paper or assignment in 2 different courses without the permission of the instructors involved. And I think I will turn it over to Paul. And Paul, bring your slides up.
Okay, were you gonna put those slides? Oh, here we go, wonderful. Okay, well, first, again, I'm Paul Abela in the philosophy department, and what I want to do are sort of 2 things today. The first is just to go through what is in the academic calendar. You are responsible for having a look at that, and you will be held to account with respect to what's in the academic calendar. So I'm just going to quickly go through, and some of this Erin just did, at least the first part of it, how plagiarism and failures to maintain academic integrity generally are described in the calendar. And then I want to rather quickly run through what the procedures are in a situation where someone was making a claim that plagiarism had occurred. So I want to give you a sense of what that process looks like, how the professor's involved, how you were involved, how witnesses can be involved, and how the appeal process works. So just to give you a kind of procedural sense of, if you find yourself in that situation, how that works, what's recorded in terms of what might come out of it, just so that you're aware. I mean, hopefully you never have to engage any of that procedural stuff, but again, it's in the calendar, you are responsible for it, and I just want to sort of paint you a quick picture of it. Okay, the first part, Erin's just gone through a good chunk of it. So on this slide, we get a description of academic integrity. And I guess there are sort of 2 parts to that. We're going to primarily today talk about plagiarism. Cheating is also contrary to academic integrity, and that's captured in the first bullet point in this description. Cheating is copying or the use of an unauthorized aid or the intentional falsification or invention of information in any academic exercise. So there's lots of different forms of cheating. We're not going to talk, I think, really about that today. I think that's more clear and fairly self-evident. Clearly, cheating is an infraction, and you will be held account with respect to it, as in addition to plagiarism. And then we just have the descriptions of plagiarism. As I say, Erin sort of mentioned this, so I won't spend a lot of time on the definition, which you have in B. I do, and it was mentioned, again, Erin mentioned in passing with respect to self-plagiarism. That sometimes trips people up a little bit. They think, well, it's my own work, so I'm free to submit it and submit it as often as I like. And of course, there are gray zones to that. You will have your own views about things. So you might be taking a philosophy course, you might be taking a history course, and you might have views, let's say, about the civil rights movement and notions of social justice. And clearly there's no problem in having views that are similar in your philosophy class and your history class, and you may well articulate those self-same views. But what you can't do is cut and paste previous work and submit it a second time without an acknowledgement from the professor in the first class and without indicating to the professor in the second class that this is identical work, because you're not going to be able to count the same stuff twice, to put it in a pithy way. And if you do fall into that, and sometimes pressures at B create conditions under which you're taking a couple of courses and they're a little bit similar, and you can quickly find yourself in a scenario where you've engaged in self-plagiarism. So I'll talk a little bit more later about some of the conditions that sometimes give rise to situations where plagiarism emerges, but you should be attentive that self-plagiarism, that's to say the submission of the same work twice, is an offense, and you will be held accountable with respect to self-plagiarism. They say sometimes that does surprise people. Erin mentioned that you can also be held account if you help someone else to plagiarize work. And in the context, which we'll speak of in a minute, about how the investigative procedures work, that can well come out in a scenario. So you do need to be attentive when you're working, and we'll talk a bit more about this later, on group projects, or if you're just in the dorm with somebody and you might be helping them. There's nothing wrong with bouncing ideas off friends. I certainly remember when I was an undergraduate, we often learned as much outside the classroom, sometimes in clubs or just informally, as occasionally we did in our classrooms. So nothing wrong with kicking ideas around, but if you actively engage in helping someone else in an act of plagiarism, you will also be held account. So please be attentive to that. And I guess one other feature, and again, Erin mentioned it just in passing, it's not explicit really in this part of the calendar, but you should be attentive to it, is that you will be held account both for intentional and unintentional plagiarism. So there could be cases, and again, I'll give you an example a little later, where it's not a willful attempt to submit someone else's work as if it's your own, but you mess up somewhere, you're sloppy in how you do your research, and you end up with a couple of sentences that are directly from someone else, and there wasn't perhaps the intention to mislead the marker, but it is still plagiarism, unintentional plagiarism, and again, you will be held account. So you want to be attentive to the notions of both self-plagiarism and unintentional plagiarism. Sometimes those seem a little more disguised, but you are responsible for them. Okay, that's a little bit, I think we can go on to the next slide, Erin, with respect to sort of definitional features, and again, we can come back to that. I want to go through now the procedures, and again, hopefully this isn't something you ever have to actually experience, and I would suggest most students don't experience this. I mean, it's important to understand plagiarism, it's important to understand the procedures, and it's important to understand that most students don't run afoul of this. Most students maintain academic integrity. I would say that is the norm. And so while we're running our way through this material and you become acquainted with it, you should take stock of the fact that most of your colleagues, most of your fellow students will be upholding the demands of academic integrity. So these are really for the outlier cases. Okay, let's have a quick look at how these procedures work. I'm not going to get into the graphs on all of this. We can go into that in a Q&A if you have some particular questions, but I just want to give you a general sense of how that process works. So if you have a look at A, which is the first step, it says an instructor who suspects a violation of academic integrity shall first attempt to determine if a potential violation exists. This determination shall involve a preliminary meeting between the instructor and the student. So, sometimes people panic about plagiarism. The professor notifies them that they want to have a meeting because they have a concern about a paper perhaps that was submitted or an exercise, and the student gets into a terrible panic. So you should. The first phase is a conversation. It's a conversation with the professor, and sometimes in that conversation, nothing more comes out of it, that the professor realizes that his or her initial judgment with respect to whether there in fact was an infraction turns out not to be realized. And if that's the case, if coming out of that first conversation, the professor makes a decision that this doesn't warrant moving to the next step, then it's done. So if you do get drawn into this process, if there is a situation where a professor suspects that there might be a plagiarism case, there is that first level where you will have a conversation. There's no department head there. There's no dean there. So it's not a frightening, scary scenario. It's one where the professor says, look, I've got a problem with this piece of work, and I want you to tell me about what happened here. So, you should sort of take stock of that. There is, I wouldn't want to exactly call it informal. It is part of the formal process, but it does have a degree of attentiveness to a particular circumstance and the professor's expert judgment with respect to whether this process needs to continue. So you should have a look at that first stage, and if you are drawn into this process, be attentive to the nature of that first stage. All right, let's go a little bit further into this process. Where a potential violation is indicated, a meeting shall be convened normally within 5 days. The meeting is to present information to determine whether an infraction is taking place, and that meeting is between the student and the professor, and normally it would involve a unit head, so that's oftentimes a department head or the head of a program. And you should be attentive that you have a right as a student to have another student, and that could just be a trusted friend, or it could be somebody from the Acadia Student Union, to be there as a witness or as an advocate. If you're a little nervous about talking in that kind of scenario, you could have someone come in and act as an advocate. So, and the professor can also have a witness to that meeting. So just taking stock then. So if in the initial meeting the professor determines that there is in fact a potential infraction, then you'll get a chance to present your side of things. The professor will get a chance to present his or her side of things. And then normally it would be the unit head then, within a certain number of time, if you have a look at step C, will then make a decision as to whether there's an infraction. And then there's another part of this process which you should be attentive to, that in the event that there is a determination that there's an infraction, what the unit head will do is they'll get in touch with the registrar, because there is going to be a registry, there is and will continue to be a registry that keeps track of the number of infractions that particular students have had in the past. And you might say, well, why is that important? Why is there a registry? Well, in a way, the registry gives a capacity for unit heads to determine the level of sanction based on the fact that, is this a first infraction, or is it a second, or unhappily, is it a third? So in that sense, the nature of the sanction, you're not going to get kicked out of the university if you violate the plagiarism strictures on a first or even on a second offense. So they're geared to, particularly on the first offense, if the unit head calls the registry's checked, you have no past offenses, this looks like a one-off. Well, it could well be that the sanction is something that's primarily educational, and you'll see that again in the following language in the document. So that registry, in a certain sense, protects students because it gives a notion of a graded response. If it's a first or it's a second offense, then the nature of the sanction is going to be appropriate to taking stock of that history. If you're dealing with scenarios of a third offense or even something, you know, beyond that, well, then there's a real pattern of violating academic integrity. And then the sanctions, of course, can be more severe. So, you know, they could imagine failing a course, or you could imagine at the far end, even expulsion. So you should be attentive that flagrant and repeated violations of academic integrity will be treated seriously by the institution. When you leave Acadia, and it's hard to think about that now because you're just starting, but when you leave Acadia, you'll have lots of memories, and as time goes on, perhaps you won't remember everything in every class. And you'll remember a few of the fun stories that you have from outside the class, no doubt. But one of those memories shouldn't be, and we'll make sure that it isn't, memories about infringing on academic integrity. That's really the lifeblood of the place. And so that's, you know, from our side, that's non-negotiable. So in scenarios where there are frequent and flagrant offenses, the institution will take that seriously, and you could be subject at the extreme end to expulsion. So, you know, I would digest that fact. Now you might say, well, even in a scenario like that, do I have the right of an appeal? Or is the initial judgment made by the relevant university officer sufficient? Yes, you do have a right of appeal. And again, you'll find that in the document under F, the student has a right of appeal. Where the determination of sanction has been made at the level of the unit head, the appeal goes to the dean. If instead the decision was made at the dean level, then it would go to the VPA. And in the case, if it was repeated and flagrant violations of academic integrity where expulsion was in play, you could also have legal representation in the appeal at that level. So yes, there is an appeal process, and the appeal process will always go one up in the chain of command. So it won't be as it were the same judge making a judgment on the appeal as to the person who initially made the judgment on the sanction. It'll be a different person. And you do have the right to representation in the appeal process. And that's important. Considerations of justice always should involve some kind of appeal process. And that appeal process, again, should move up the chain of command with respect to who makes that judgment. Just having, as I say, there's a little bit more detail in this, but I'm not going to get into all the nuts and the bolts about different variations between heads and deans. I think we could, if we need to, we can deal with that in the Q&A. And again, maybe just the last thing to note in section H, I mentioned this in passing already, and that's the registrar does keep that registry of past offenses. So there is a record in the registrar's office, and as I say, I think the most useful way of thinking about that is that it in a way is protection, because it means there's always graduated forms of sanction in cases where we have a demonstrated case of plagiarism, and in that way the sanction is always fitting to what prompts it. So you're not going to get whacked with expulsion on a first offense. Instead, that's going to be something that's reserved for situations where, for whatever reason, the learning process has been frustrated and you're in a situation where you're repeating the offense. But as I say, that is kept in the registrar's office, and that will stay there the whole time, and I think even for a number of years after you've left. So that is a kind of record at the registrar's office. Okay, Erin, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to say in terms of process.
Okay, so I want to talk a bit about, oh, and Paul, I'm getting a bit of feedback. Is your mic still on?
Yeah, let me just mute.
And I apologize, I left mine on for your whole thing too. And I was afraid to switch out of the PowerPoint to unmute, and anyway. That's better, thank you. So I wanted to talk about why this matters, apart from the possibility of the penalties that Paul just talked about. And the most stunning example I have of why this really, really matters and how it could really have a huge impact on your life. It's a story I actually read about in our own student newspaper in the Athenaeum several years ago. It's an old story, but it could still happen, still pretty relevant. And you could Google it. If you Googled Wanda Young and memorial, and maybe throw plagiarism in there, you'd get it. There's a story in the Globe and Mail about it, as well as our student newspaper. I just Googled it to refresh my memory on it, and the first link that came up for me was the results of the Supreme Court of Canada case that resulted from a student's unintentional plagiarism. So yeah, this woman, Wanda Young, was a student at Memorial. She was in the Department of Social Work, and her lifelong dream was to be a social worker, and particularly to work with adult survivors of sex abuse that occurred when they were children. You know, so that's a pretty altruistic, wonderful career goal. And she was writing a paper, and it was in 1994, so yes, it was a long time ago, but could still happen. She was writing a paper, and I don't know why she did this. It sounds like maybe she was trying to add more pages to make the paper length requirement. I don't know, that's my guess. But anyway, what she did was she added a couple of pages at the end of her paper, so her paper in her own words, and then she added this appendix that was a first-person account of sexual abuse told from the perspective of the abuser. So it was, and she grabbed this from a textbook, a social work textbook. She just copied and pasted this whole first-person account, and it was like a babysitting situation, and it was a female abuser of kids in her care. So the voice in this is I did this, I did that. Pretty unpleasant stuff to read. And she in no way indicated that this was a quotation, that the I was not her. So she submits this paper to her professor, The professor gets to the appendix, freaks out, as one would, and thinks this is a confession or a cry for help or something. Now, I don't know what Memorial's policies are, or were at the time, but they certainly weren't like Acadia's now, because as Paul explained, the first step would be for that professor to sit down with the student. That didn't happen. The professor went straight to the RCMP. The student's name got on a child abuse registry. Student had no idea for years. And it wasn't until years later, she was trying to apply to graduate school in social work and was denied entrance. So then she was trying to get a job in social work and she couldn't get a job because her name that had been put on the child abuse registry was also getting reflagged by police and social agencies every time she applied for a job with vulnerable people. So nice to know that that system works, but unfortunate that her name was on it in the first place. So when she finally figured out what's going on here, why can't I get a job, and figured out what had happened, she sued. She sued Memorial University, and she won. She won an $800,000 settlement in 2003. Now this happened in 1994, and it didn't get to court until 2003. And then Memorial appealed it, and Memorial won the appeal. And then Wanda Young appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada, and she won at the Supreme Court of Canada in 2006. So this woman's life was ruined for 12 years and may still be, you know, once your name gets out there on these things. So that's a really extreme example, totally true. You can Google it, all true, but very extreme. That's really unlikely to happen. But all she had to do was put an opening quotation mark at the beginning of that appendix and an end quotation mark at the end of it, and just a little footnote to say where she got it from. And for the failure to do that, yeah, like her life is ruined. So don't do that. But if we return to normal life and my earlier metaphor of the research process, like a conversation in time across the years, where scholar X writes something some time ago, you find it, engage with it now in 2020. The reason it's crucial to cite scholar X or whoever, besides the fact that it's plagiarism if you don't do it and bad things can happen. But the other reason, the practical reason, is to allow your reader to also engage with scholar X and to participate in that conversation across the years or through the years, so that your reader knows the context in which you're situating your contributions. And also so your reader can, if she wants, consult scholar X herself. Sometimes that does happen. You're reading something and you see a footnote and go, oh, I want to follow that footnote. I want to check out that source. That looks interesting. And in fact, that's a really important way of how you find more sources when you're doing your own research. You find one source that's on topic. Chances are the sources that person used to write that piece of work are also going to be on topic. So you can mine the footnotes or the bibliography to find more things. That's a great strategy. But if they haven't done it properly, you can't do it. But if it's all done right, you kind of have this conversation going backwards in time to scholar X and forwards with your future reader or readers, and then your future reader back to scholar X. If you fail to cite scholar X, you cut off one whole chunk of that conversation. And it's a punishable academic offense. So that's why the principle of citation matters. But it's not just the principle that matters, the mechanics of citation matter too. The nuts and bolts of how you actually do it. And there are hundreds, probably thousands actually, of different citation styles, all with their own rules. And if you're lucky, you'll probably only have to learn one, maybe two at Acadia. Don't worry about that now. That's another story. But once you're actually working on an assignment and using a citation style, and your prof will tell you, and if they don't, ask, but your prof will tell you, you must use this style or that style. Once you're there, the details of how you do it do actually matter. And we're not going to get into those details here because I don't know what styles you guys are going to be using. So you can always get help with that at the point of need. You can always ask your professor. you can always ask your librarian. And you do have a librarian for every single subject at Acadia, no matter what. So you can ask, you can always get help with this. But I used to always wonder why the details mattered so much, because it can get very fussy about you have to have a semicolon here and a comma there, and this has to be italicized and that has to be capitalized. It's very, very picky. And there, I don't know if we have any business students here, but there's one notorious business prof who will dock big marks for little tiny picky things like that, like putting a comma instead of a period in the citations. Really picky. And that just always seemed unfair to me. Your professors tell you you've got to use secondary sources, and then they nail you when you don't do it quite right. But I have figured it out. So the whole point of the citation is for your reader or readers to be able to find easily the sources you've used, track them down themselves. And if your reader can find the source easily, whether you've used a comma or a semicolon or haven't italicized something, who cares, right? Well, sometimes it actually matters. I'm going to share my screen again and go back to my slides. Okay, so this is a book that you probably can't escape in university if you didn't already have to read it in high school, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. And these are all the elements of a citation. So there's author first name, author last name, year of publication, title, and who published it. And I'm pretty sure all of you can tell what the author's first name is here and what the title is without it being in perfect citation style. So here it is. And I'm an English person, so I use a style called MLA. So here it is in MLA. Same information, just presented in a certain way, in a certain order with certain punctuation separating certain elements. But, you know, if I'd made a hash of it, you'd still know it was Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, published in 1999. Not every resource is as obvious. Now, I got to admit I made these up, but could happen. So this is a book written by somebody, and we can all tell that it was published in 2016, but apart from that, you know, I bet if I challenged Paul to tell me what the author's last name is, he'd have a 1 in 4 chance. But if I put it in this case, again, MLA format, it suddenly becomes much easier to figure it out, especially in Western civilization. We're used to this kind of last name, comma, first name business. So you can tell this guy is named Bradley George. First name Bradley, last name George. And we're also used to titles of things being emphasized somehow. So in this case, it's a book about some Richard or other. And here's another one where I've done kind of the same thing. Again, no clue which is which bit until you put it into the style. So that's why it matters. That's why the principle matters, that the mechanics also matters. So I'm going to hand it over to Paul again. First, I'm going to mute myself and then come back to the slides.
Okay, I just wanted, for the second part of what I'm doing, just to add a couple of kind of thoughts from the professor's side on plagiarism, and also some thoughts that relate to material. When I was chairing the Academic Integrity Committee for the Senate, you know, we get feedback from professors, and you know, there's some themes that have come out of that, so I can just share a couple of those. The first one where, you know, in addition to sort of, we've been discussing so far about issues about plagiarism in the context of you working on a particular thing in a kind of one-to-one relation, but there'll certainly be cases, Erin mentioned the business school, and not just the business school, but other places across campus where you may be involved in team projects, small T team projects, collective work. And you do need to be very clear with the professor as to what the standards are with respect to evaluation in that kind of context. So is it a corporate mark where you're all, you know, there's 4 of you working on a project, there'll be 1 mark for it, and there's no distinction with respect to what different people are contributing to? and what they're handing in. Are they handing it in as a corporate entity, or is it being handed in as individual features? If it's individual features, can they have corporate content in them, or do they each have to be yours? Are you claiming ownership with respect to what you're handing in individually? So what's really important if you're involved in team projects or collective projects is to be very clear upfront. Make sure there's no ambiguity with respect to the nature of the evaluation, and in a certain sense what you own and what you don't own when you are submitting material, because there can be scenarios where you're working collectively but you're submitting individually, and it can't be the case therefore that all four are identical because you're individually being evaluated. So make sure that the modality of evaluation and collective activity is very clear at the outset, and that just helps to avoid confusion. Another thing which I don't have on that slide in part one, but again, thinking back to some of the feedback we got on that committee from professors, is it's worth remembering, in scenarios where, and in the age that we live in, with the easy capacity to share information, including previous assignments in courses or essays in courses, which maybe float around in the dorms a little bit potentially. It's often the case, it's worth remembering, that professors have often taught courses for many years, and I can tell you personally, if I think of, say, the Philosophy of the Environment course, which I teach out of the philosophy department but for the environmental studies program, I've taught that course pretty much every year for more years than I'd care to admit, and I've got a pretty good memory of material that's come before me, and I can tend to smell out material that's passed my way before. So you should be attentive that material that perhaps is floating around in the ether in various ways did have a home somewhere, and your professors will be attentive to that. And I have had cases where something's come back, and I might even have a physical record of the original entry of the material, and if not, I will, like a pit bull, track it down. So be attentive. Again, this is an outlier problem, but in a scenario where material was floating around, be attentive that material does have a history. The second one, and this has to do with unintentional plagiarism, which I mentioned and Erin's mentioned as well. This can foul up lots of well-meaning scholars and students. And the example I give you in paragraph 2 there is Doris Kearns Goodwin. She's a Pulitzer Prize winning historian, American historian. Most of her work has been on American presidents, Lincoln, FDR, and others. And so Pulitzer Prize, it doesn't get much better than that. And yet she, through inattention and to a degree sloppiness in her research, was found to have plagiarized material, and not just in one book. She, when this was discovered, acknowledged it, so she owned it. She resigned from the Pulitzer Prize in History Committee. She lost many of the, I remember I was first introduced to her scholarship on the NewsHour, PBS nightly news program, where she was one of the scholars they would routinely bring in. When this story came out, she lost her job there. And it was clearly a case of unintentional plagiarism. She got sloppy with material, and then some sentences from some of that research had appeared in her book in her own words without quotations, and she hadn't in fact written them. And it wasn't that she was stealing material. She was a gifted writer and a clear thinker in the domain of history, but it was sloppiness. And she was trained, she's even older than I am, and was trained in an age really that was before the cut and paste world. And when she moved into the cut and paste world, unfortunately, the systems that she had in place to catch that before dropped off, and she didn't really have vigorous ones to replace them. So you should be very attentive that the technology, and it's wonderful technology. I mean, it has opened up domains of scholarship that in some ways were impossible before. So, nobody should be a Luddite with respect to the relationship between technology and scholarship. When used properly, it's wonderful. But it does have certain kinds of structural dangers. And the cut and paste world, one of those dangers can be that if you're not very attentive, it's easy enough for material that you've taken from one place to get disconnected from its initial context, and then you think you misremember, and you think, oh yes, I remember writing that, and pretty soon it's in your essay. So please be attentive to some of those structural features that come out of the technology, and find ways to equip yourself for very carefully identifying material that you've taken from a source, as opposed to kind of scratch pad material that you've been working on that, excuse me, that that ends up forming the body of an essay or an assignment. Number 3, I mentioned this sort of in passing when we looked at the procedures, but I do want to stress, don't panic if you get an email from somebody's really interested in getting through to me just at this moment when I'm on. Yeah, don't panic if you get an email from a professor who wants to set up a meeting in the context of a potential plagiarism case. As I said, that first scenario where you're having that conversation with the professor could be a kind of misunderstanding, and it can well be the case that that can be a kind of learning experience without any sanctions if it's not a case of plagiarism. So I guess that's one thing we're speaking seriously about it. It's a serious matter. But it isn't something that you should get into a panic with. And even if it is a case of first offense, which does happen to students, not the majority of students, but a minority of students, the sanction for first offense isn't going to be severe. And it really can be a learning experience. And you can avoid the kind of thing that happens to someone like Doris Kearns Goodwin later in her career, which has huge costs, both in terms of her life and her reputation. So, I would take half a step back if you get into the process and remember, particularly in a first or potentially even a second offense, that your life isn't ruined. It's not. It can be something that you come out stronger going through the process than when you began. And maybe the last thing to note, I have it there in sentence 4, is there can be conditions that create a framework in which plagiarism can be more tempting. Hopefully you're never tempted by it, but we're all fallen creatures in different ways. And one of the things that again we noted in the Academic Integrity Committee when we got feedback from students was that one of the conditions under which sometimes plagiarism can emerge is just the stress of piling up material. If you're a full-time student, you're doing 4 or 5 courses, there are a lot of tests, there's a lot of assignments, essays, projects, and it's important at the beginning of the term when you have the syllabus for each course to kind of map it out a little bit. Get a sense of, oh, I'm going to need a few days for that, I'm going to need a week for this, maybe I should get that written, leave it for a few days, come back to it, so I need to think about how I'm going to budget my time. What you want to avoid is that pile-up scenario where essays are piling up, they're not done, you're panicked, you're stressed, and maybe you're looking for an easy out. And so there are certain kinds of conditions that can give rise to the temptation for plagiarism, and you can stage manage some of that. Just by at the beginning of the term, making sure that that you sort of map out, you have a kind of game plan for the term. And if you do suffer from stress, and that's completely normal, there are certain kinds of stress reduction strategies that you can use. You can plug into some of the resources on campus. I might actually, as I'm just about done here, put a little plug in. I think Erin, in fact, might be someone who could tell us a little bit about one of the things that the library does with respect to stress reduction for students. So take those things seriously. They can, I mean, they're good to do generally. They'll make you a better student, but they can also help to damp down some of the conditions under which infringements to academic integrity can take place.
Back to me, I think. Paul, you mentioned the Pulitzer Prize winning historian. Anybody following, and how can you not kind of sort of follow the US presidential election coming up? Biden has been not really caught, but the Trump campaign is dredging up something from Biden's last presidential run decades ago, where he failed to cite somebody. And again, totally unintentional. He'd cited this person in plenty of other speeches, but in one he forgot, and now the Trump campaign is seizing on that. You see it all the time, and it does have a huge effect on people's livelihoods and careers in those cases. So what I want to finish up on, and this is the last little chunk of the formal presentation before we throw it open to the Q&As, I wanted to mention a couple of resources that can help you with all this. One of them, I wish I could show it, but it's not quite ready. We're still working on it. Years and years and years ago, the library developed a tutorial, an anti-plagiarism tutorial. It's called You Quote It, You Note It, which was hugely popular. It's been in use at schools and colleges and universities all over the world, literally like thousands. We made it available under a free license for people to adapt. And it's won awards. It's kind of great, but we wrote it in Flash, and Adobe is pulling the plug on Flash at the end of this year. So we've had to rewrite it in HTML5, and we're just still in that process. But when it's done, and we hope to have it done before the start of classes or very soon thereafter, we will try to get a message out to the all students email list. So you will hear about that, and it's pretty good. Another thing you can use, and if Paul's example of the scholar there had something like this that might have helped with the sloppiness, it's something called Zotero. I'm going to do a screen share here again so you can see it. There we go. No, it didn't quite do it. Okay, there we go. It's pretty ugly looking. It's not very friendly looking, but it is really easy to use. It has a very unfriendly name too. It's called Bibliographic Management Software, but it's basically an app that lets you manage all your resources, whether they're from the web, whether they're print. I use it actually, and you can see over here. So this is my serious stuff. I was doing a music therapy search for somebody, but I use it for recipes all the time. I also use it, you know how sometimes you have like 40 million tabs open on your browser and you're living in terror of your computer dying and losing all that stuff that you've got open. I just click a little, it's like a little bookmarklet thing, and they go into Zotero and they're saved. I can search for them easily by keyword. And it also attaches in Zotero an offline copy. So even if the power goes out, or if the website has moved or changed, you have a saved copy automatically at the push of a button. It's great. So if you ever want to use that, and I would recommend starting to use it immediately because it is very easy. It takes about 5 minutes to set up. Just contact your librarian. And to do that, say you are a kinesiology student. If you go to the library homepage, oh, that's not sharing, is it? Hang on a second. Just a second. Let me come back in here. Let me unshare this and share. Yes, I want to share. Share the desktop. And there we go. Okay. So if you go to the library homepage and type in whatever your subject area is, music, kinesiology, philosophy, doesn't matter. Just type it in. And you get a bunch of results. We call these results a bento box display because there are different boxes with different kinds of results. But if you scroll down to the subject guides, there is a subject guide for every subject at Acadia. And if you just click on that, it'll take you to the guide, which has all kinds of useful stuff. But perhaps one of the most useful things is, where's Maggie? It usually shows you a picture of your librarian. Where is she? Yo, there she is. And so the librarian for kinesiology is Maggie. That's her adorable dog, Tippy. But you can get in touch with that person and they can show you, like I said, in 5 minutes, how to set up Zotero and use it. It's really easy. The last thing I want to show you, and everybody loves this when I show it to them in classes. I usually show first year, second year students. By third year, fourth year, most people have found it, but like there's a visible gasp when I show this. The students are just like, oh my God, that's amazing. So say you're doing a paper on Dracula, very common subject in any first year English course you may have to take. And here we are in the bento box display again. And say I want to look about an article about Dracula. If I click on the title of the article, it's going to give me information about the article, how to find it, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things it gives me, once I'm in here, it's taking its time to load. Okay, so here's this article about Dracula, and I have all these little things along here. One of them is citation, and most of our databases have something like this. So look for citation or cite. And when I click on that, I get, let me scroll down, a little pop-up that lets me choose the most common citation styles. The most commonly one used at Acadia is APA. Business uses it, Kines uses it, psychology uses it. A lot of people use it. It's the most common one. But I can cut and paste. So that is going to save you a ton of possible typos and mistakes with the little commas and the semicolons and whatnot. So I'm just going to paste that into a Word document. And there's my citation. I do just a word of caution. You still do need to cast an eye over it. It works quite well, but every once in a while it makes a little mistake. So you still have to proofread it just like you proofread your whole paper. But again, you can ask your librarian about this tool anytime. And that's what I want to finish on. Please don't be afraid to get help. Please don't be afraid to ask your professor about these things. That's a really good question to go with your professor about, saying, am I doing this right? They'll know then that you are attentive to these issues and doing your best not to screw it up. That's a really good conversation to have with your professor and a good contact to make with them and a good impression on them. If you're terrified of your professor, and some students are, I hope you won't be, but your librarians are there too. I don't think we're scary, and we are not the ones grading you. So sometimes that's a little refreshing too. But that's all I want to say. I don't know, Paul, if you want to add on anything, or if we should go straight to Q&A.
Yeah, it's a good Q&A.
Anna, you're muted.
Thank you. I just have one question, if you'd be willing to just show this. I know there's a citation help and more site on the library page. It's the one library.acadiau.ca/research/citation-help at HTML or .html. And I think it's the one that has sort of the list of the style guides. Would you be willing to sort of show that one so that the students can sort of see where they can start to get that info and maybe also reach some librarians?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. I think I know what you mean.
I have it here too. I can link it if it helps. But
well, I was gonna just, because it's this will give me a chance to show how handy this search box on the library homepage is, because you can use this for everything. You can use this for your research, but if you just need help, so citation help, I think this will work. Let me, I've never tried this before, but let me see. So if I do citation help, and in the bento box display at the bottom, there's a box for the library website. It works. So that's searching our library website, and that will, is this what you're talking about, Anna?
Yes, and I know you don't want to get into the weeds with the style guides and stuff, but it might be worth just showing where they are anyway and that kind of thing. Maybe just
Right.
going
So,
through where they're used.
yeah, we have common ones for APA. Oh, and this is where the tutorial is going to show up. Here's the old Flash one, but that tutorial I was talking about that's under development will be, so the old one is still there and still working, and there's a couple more. Yeah, if we go to APA, so it's a whole guide on APA. It's got examples. It's also got a tab on how to use Zotero that I talked about, so you can learn about it there. It also links out to some other sources, and one of the best ones, and your professors will recommend this one too, is a site from the University of Purdue in the States, or Purdue University, it's called the Online Writing Lab, or the OWL. And if you just Google APA style or MLA style or whatever style your professor tells you to use, this is almost always the first hit, is the sites for all these different styles from the Purdue OWL. It's really, really good, really easy to use. Does that cover it, Anna?
Thanks so much, Erin. I just thought that might be a good resource page.
Okay. So there's a number of questions over in the Q&A, so I will read some of the questions off, and Erin and Paul can answer the questions. So first question from Anonymous says, would it be safer to overly cite your sources? For an example, if you take two sources to make a sentence, cite both sources. I'll give that over to Paul, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you're never going to get penalized for overcitation. So I start there. If you're ever in doubt, your default should be to oversight. The particular example you give of, you've said a sentence that has two sources. I'm trying to kind of visualize what that would be, but as I say, if you feel that the two sources are necessary to capture the content which is unique to the authorship of those two original sources, yes, I would cite them both. I mean, it's worth noting, and of course there are judgment calls. I mean, there are some ideas that are ideas in the popular domain, and so you're not citing every idea that occurs in a paper. You're citing, unique content that you're claiming ownership of, that is in fact in the hand of someone else. So there can be gray cases, and certainly, professors, at least in my experience, tend to be generous in interpreting that gray zone. But at some stage, the gray zone does bleed into where you don't want to be. So yes, I'd say if you're in doubt, put in as many sources as you think are necessary. You will never get in trouble for doing that.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I see another question here from another anonymous. I know someone said that we will be taught how to cite sources, but as someone who has never been taught how to cite sources, how will we make sure we will be taught it? I'll give that to Erin, although she did answer this in the.
Well, that's a good question. You should be taught it. I can't speak for every single professor. I think there might be some who think that you may have been taught it in high school. I'm not sure that every professor covers it in the same depth and detail. So if you are unsure, I would ask your professor if you have a professor. And I actually know there are some professors who just don't care what style you use as long as you're consistent. They'll often say that, or as long as it's easy to find the source. So they won't teach the mechanics of MLA or APA or Chicago or whatever style. So actually, I'm quite sure there are some professors who don't really cover it very much. So I think you just need to approach those professors and find out what their expectations are. And if they do teach it and you're still confused, ask for more help or come to the library, your librarian, and we can help with that too. Sometimes it's great to talk to both, because sometimes having two people explain it in slightly different ways is helpful. So I would say just keep asking for help.
Can I jump in? Yeah, I'm just seconding what Erin's just said. I mean, I'm one of those professors. I want a consistent format for citation, but I usually leave it up as long as it's APA or Chicago style, or if it's something that's a major citation a template, I'm fine with that. And some students prefer one to another, but I do direct them to library resources. And in fact, I've also occasionally had, usually more with students who are writing research papers, I might bring in a librarian, and I'm sure Erin can speak to this in other classes. Well, we'll bring in some expertise and might dedicate a class precisely for citation in different styles. And as I say, bring in library resources actually into the classroom to do that.
And I think I might add, there are some slight differences in disciplines, not only as to particular citation styles, but also, for example, in chemistry, I happen to be a chemistry professor. We don't have a lot of papers in our first year courses. You probably don't start getting papers till second year. And when we really start getting fussy about citations is when we start having you write research papers that are similar to what's in the literature. In early courses, you may have some longer types of papers to write, and in those we'll typically say, be consistent. We won't nail you down to a certain style, but we would like you to use an accepted style. So you may see a lot of differences within disciplines as well.
Just a comment about just going back to what you just said, Jeff. I'm in physics, as you know, and in labs and stuff as well. And I would imagine in chemistry as well, if there's a more of a formal lab write-up, even at the first year level, you definitely want to cite any sources for any theory or background as well. So just keep that in mind in courses in general. If you're writing a lab write-up, if you don't think it's a paper, you should still be citing your sources in some format.
Yeah, and you should definitely ask your instructor if you are in any doubt or you feel that maybe they didn't mention it. Be sure to ask because they may not know that they didn't mention it, so that will be helpful. There's a couple of questions here that I see Anna has answered, so I'm going to go on. Here we go, from Anonymous. Anonymous is very popular today. What is the most common citation style for taking philosophy courses and psychology? So I'm going to give that one to Paul, since philosophy was mentioned. And make sure your mic is on, Paul.
Yeah, I don't think that there is an answer to that. I mean, I think it, at least in, as I say, in my courses, certainly, I mean, I often recommend Chicago style, but I'm open to other styles. So I perhaps a little bit more Chicago style, but I'm not, as I say, I to some degree allow the students the freedom to use the style that they prefer as long as it's consistent. But maybe Chicago style would be slightly more represented, at least in my courses in philosophy. I can't speak to psychology.
I can speak to psychology, actually, even though I'm English and music, but psychology uses APA. APA stands for American Psychological Association. It's their style. I would be extremely surprised if any psychology prof asked you to use anything other than APA.
Okay, and I don't see any further questions. Would any of our moderator or our subject matter experts like to add anything additional at this point? Seeing shaking of heads, and I'll just, if you have any further questions, I don't see any popping up, so just like to thank everybody for attending today, and I'd like to thank Erin and Paul for a wonderful talk. I learned a lot as well, so thank you very much.